It is a pleasure to join you, and I thank Mike Bloomberg, a member of the UN family and a good friend, for bringing us together. You gather as the world faces a health crisis, economic wreckage, and a climate emergency. The United Nations has been working to save lives, to control transmission of the virus, and to ease the fallout. And we are advocating a massive rescue package for the world's most vulnerable people and countries, and pressing for a global ceasefire and fighting misinformation. We must also learn the lessons of the pandemic. Even before the spread of the virus, inequalities were rising, societal divisions were widening, and the lack of opportunities was causing frustration and unrest. We must address these ills too. Unfortunately, solutions exist, technology is on our side, and we may just be at a potential turning point on climate change. And let me concentrate on climate change, that I believe is the defining issue of the 21st century. Recently, we have heard encouraging announcements. The European Union, Japan, the Republic of Korea, together with more than 110 other countries, have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050, and China has done it before 2060. By early 2021, countries representing more than 65% of global carbon dioxide emissions and more than 70% of the world economy are very likely to have made ambitious commitments to carbon neutrality. The signal this sends to markets, institutional investors, and decision makers is clear. Carbon must be given a price. The time of fossil fuel subsidies is over. We must phase out coal. We must shift the tax burden from income to carbon, from taxpayers to polluters. Financial reporting on exposure to climate risks should be made mandatory. Authorities must integrate the goal of carbon neutrality in all economic and fiscal policies and decisions in order to truly transform industry, agriculture, transportation, and the energy sector. And 2021 must be the year of the great leap forward towards carbon neutrality. Every country, city, financial institution, and company should adopt plans for transitioning to net zero emissions by 2050. And we recognize the vital role of business and the private sector, and we want to work together more closely. The United Nations is pressing with key initiatives and partnerships, including the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and several others. And let me stress that the coalition for net zero emissions cannot be global without developing countries, which will need significant support. And let's recognize that this shift will be difficult. We need a just transition with training and assistance for those who will lose jobs or be affected in other ways. But let us remember that even as we strive to mitigate emissions in the future, we need to address the impacts that are already happening. According to a recent report, only 1/5 of climate finance goes to adaptation. Only 14% of recent financing went to the least developed countries, and only 2% to the small island developing states. This is not only insufficient, it is dangerous. Adaptation should not be the forgotten component of climate action. And finally, let's be smart. That will require financing, private and public, but these are investments in a safer, more prosperous and sustainable future. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all rightly focused on responding to the pandemic, but as we strive to overcome one crisis, we have an opening to address another. The pandemic has shown that we can think big and act big in the face of an emergency. We have crucial decisions to make in the weeks and months ahead. And the private sector will be absolutely key. We see the private sector moving forward more quickly than governments. We see that private sector is pushing governments to adopt the right measures in taxation, in regulation, in their own investments. And we believe that national development banks, international financial institutions, regional development banks need to play a key role in supporting with partnerships the private sector and in de-risking private investments and finance to be able to reach developing countries, and at the same time to improve the governance of those countries and to make sure that the rule of law is respected there. This is the moment of a great global coalition for net zero. I'm very optimistic we are going to have it.
Secretary General, thank you so much for the remarks. I'm Francine Lacqua from Bloomberg, and I wanted to pick up on the need for bigger and better carbon markets. How quickly do you think we'll get that?
Well, we have, first of all, we have a difficulty, as you know, in the COP in relation to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. I've seen how the negotiations have failed in both in Poland and in Spain. I'm hopeful that the British presidency of the COP will be able to bring together the different countries and to find a way out of it. For that, we need to take into account that a number of countries, India, Brazil, and others, are very keen on the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And so we must find a compromise. And I believe that compromise is possible, and we'll do everything to make it happen. But on the same time, we are seeing already the private sector building its own carbon market. 42 companies have recently established the basis for a private autonomous market to move forward. I think this will be a fantastic initiative. And there are other ways to put a price on carbon, and one of them is to shift taxation from income. Income like payroll, or income like corporate income in relation to the possibility of waivers for investments, for instance, in the green economy. If we shift taxation from income to carbon, we'll help to put a price on carbon. So put the markets to work, tax wherever it makes sense, and I believe that there will be a price in carbon very soon, widespread in the global economy.
Secretary General, what do you expect concretely from President Biden on climate change, his key priority?
Well, I believe that he has announced that the US will commit to net zero emissions in 2050. I believe that he has committed to a number of very important transformations in the US economy. And again, the role of the US private sector, the role of cities, the role of the different states has been so dynamic, and Mike Bloomberg has been so active in pushing for it, that we are already seeing in the US very important steps moving in the right direction. What happened to coal? And again, a very important Mike Bloomberg initiative is the proof of that. So I think that with the government committed to move forward, with the government committed to do the right thing, I believe the extraordinary dynamic of the American society will allow us to reach net zero emissions in 2050.
Are you hopeful that we have a vaccine next year? And is it a danger that if we have a vaccine, then we go back to what it was like in 2018? So less commonality, less multilateralism, less working together, and less on climate change.
I believe it's absolutely essential to consider that a vaccine or innovative treatments must be a global public good, must be available and affordable to everybody everywhere. That doesn't mean, obviously, that developed countries will not be able to make their contracts with the different manufacturers that in between will emerge, but it's necessary that that is complemented by a strong commitment to the COVAX that is already gathering not only the World Health Organization, Gavi, CEPI, the Global Fund, but also more than 160 countries in the world committed to make sure that we make this vaccine, the future vaccines, available to, as I said, everybody, everywhere. And I do believe that it's perfectly possible to combine the two things. I'm not asking vaccines not to be available to the American public or to my own public in a European country, but we need to be able to combine the need to protect the citizens of each country with the need to understand that they will not be effectively protected if citizens of all other countries are not simultaneously protected.
What will the legacy of the virus be on the economy? And is there a danger that if our economy weakens further, if inequality rises, then we'll have less peace around the world?
Now, inequality for many, many decades was perceived as something that was essential for economic development. Inequality was essential for the concentration of capital, and without that concentration of capital, development would not be possible. Today, we have understood that that has reached a limit. And we have understood that inequality became a serious threat to development in itself, obviously not allowing enough people to get access to the global markets. But inequality is becoming a central factor of instability in countries. Look at what's happening with elections everywhere. Even here, the results of elections are starting to be put into questions everywhere. We see local unrest developing in many countries, and some aspects of this local unrest are leading to real conflicts. So to have a strong commitment to reduce inequality, to improve opportunities for all, is, in my opinion, a fundamental aspect of the way we recover from the pandemic. To recover in a way that is sustainable, climate change is essential, but it is also inclusive, which means that everybody must be on board, and we need to rebuild trust between the people and countries, the people and governments, and the people and the institutions, including the international institutions like the UN.
But Secretary General, how worried are you that the sitting president of the world's superpower and actually the largest UN donor has still refused to concede the elections?
Well, I think that that problem will probably be solved soon. We don't interfere in the electoral processes of any country in the world, and I must say I have total confidence in the solidity of the US institutions.
So how do you regain that trust? How do politicians speak to their people to make sure that inequality is addressed, that inequality gets better, and that we build a more sustainable, greener future?
I think politicians need to show that they care. One of the problems in public opinions around the world is this idea that those that are in political power do not care but about their own power, do not care but about themselves and their interests and the way to prolong their power. There is this sense when we see jobs being lost, when we see lives being put into question, when we see the anxiety that exists, there is this feeling that those that have responsibilities in government or international institutions, they really do not care. They only care about themselves. It's absolutely necessary that governments show that they really care and demonstrate it in the adoption of policies, in the action they take. I mean, even in the image they project. One of the terrible things when we see the news is that there are very little news related to how governments and institutions are trying to solve the problems of people, and lots of news about struggle for power, about, how the elites are pursuing their own interests. We must change this. Power is something that is given to people to serve other people. If power goes on being conceived as a privilege of those that have it, we are all doomed.
But is that reallocating resources within countries? Is it reallocating resources on a world level?
I think we need both. I think we need a new social contract in each country with primacy for education and for access to the digital economy and the digital instruments to everybody. Internet is, as you know, only available for half of the global population. We need to make sure that we find new social protection mechanisms to address what is inevitably a dramatic change in the relations between work and leisure. I would say not only work and leisure, but work, leisure, and other activities. Some of them we don't even imagine what they will be in 10 or 20 or 30 years. We need to prepare societies for this change. And this requires, as I said, a new social contract in which societies as a whole, and of course governments and the political systems have a key role to play, but also the civil society, businesses, find a way to address the completely different environment in which we'll be living in our countries in the future. But then we need also a new global deal. We need to understand that power, resources, and opportunities need to be better distributed and better shared at world level. For instance, even the institutions we have, look at the United Nations Security Council or the Bretton Woods institutions, they still represent the world that existed after the Second World War. The world has changed. The economies are now very different from what they were. The relative dimension of those economies is very different. We need to adapt our institutions to what is the reality of the economy and the society of today. And we need to understand that at the global level, we need a redistribution of power, a redistribution of resources, and the capacity to make international cooperation and international solidarity really effective. And we need probably to stress our governance mechanisms. We have more and more global challenges. The populist approaches to the COVID have demonstrated that populism is not a solution. The solution is in international cooperation. But for international cooperation, as we move into a multipolar world, we need multilateral forms of governance, because if not, the multipolar world by itself can be a source of new conflicts.
What about debt relief? I know you've been doing quite a lot of work on debt relief, and this is probably one of the most important points, but has it become too political?
I think that we absolutely need to address the structural problems of debt in today's world. The worst thing that we could have is a series of bankruptcies of country after country, creating an environment in which a global depression would be inevitable. I do believe that the initiative that was taken for the G20 for the least developed countries is positive. It needs to be prolonged until the end of 2021, but it needs also to be expanded to developing and middle-income countries that have no access to financial markets at the present moment. There was a huge increase in global liquidity, and those middle-income countries that have more solid foundations in their economies have managed to benefit from it, but there is a lot of countries, look at the small island development states here in the Caribbean or the Pacific, that are totally dependent on tourism, and they are middle-income countries, but they are now in a dramatic debt situation. So we need to have, for those countries, also the mechanism that was put in place, and to look more seriously into a global framework allowing for debt relief and for some review of the global debt architecture in order to make sure that global finance will be sustainable and that we avoid this kind of domino effect that could be devastating for the global economy.
If you look at the big countries that hold a lot of this debt, one of them is China. Are they doing enough for debt relief in this pandemic?
Now, for the moment, let's be clear, no. For the moment, what we have, as I said, is an initiative about suspension of debt payments for the least developed countries, but not enough has been made in relation to all others that are in trouble and can make us all be in trouble. So this is the moment in which I think it will be necessary also to have better coordination and transparency. We need to make the Club of Paris and China work together. We need to bring the private sector into this equation. We need to see how credit rating agencies work. I mean, there is a lot that needs to be done. And obviously, central banks have been playing a very important role with the injection of liquidity they have done in their own countries with some swaps that they made. But for the moment, let's be honest, we are far from doing what is needed. And let's not forget that the crisis is not over. Next year will be a year in which there will be the need again to massively support our economies worldwide. And so a much, I would say, more, I wouldn't say generous, a much more intelligent approach to debt will be absolutely essential. Debt and liquidity are two things that are perfectly interlinked and are vital for the recovery to be global and to be effective.
Secretary General, I was going to ask you about multilateralism and how much of a hit that's taken in recent years, but actually you've been at the UN for, I think, a little over 4 years. What surprised you the most during that time?
Well, I think that what for me is the biggest source of hope is to see young people. Young people is much more cosmopolitan than my generation. Young people are much less nationalistic and much less prone to populist approaches. And young people has shown a strong commitment to the causes that are the causes of today's world. The questions of climate change, the questions of gender equality, the questions related to racism or the need to fight against racism. So what I believe is that we are seeing the emergence of a generation that will be being much more cosmopolitan. I hope will be the foundation of a new series of reforms in the global order, allowing for multilateralism, international cooperation, and solidarity in a much broader scope than what it is possible today.
And you think multilateralism is back, will be back?
Multilateralism is essential. I mean, we are going slowly. For the moment, we have no longer a bipolar world. We have no longer a unipolar world. When I was in government in Portugal, this was the moment of the US hyperpower. I mean, I remember that when we needed an intervention in East Timor to avoid a massacre there or a genocide there, the only thing that mattered was to convince the President of the United States. The moment Bill Clinton was convinced that was necessary, everything happened. Security Council voted, the Australians led the operation, Indonesia accepted it, and the East Timor problem was solved. Today, it's not like that. Power is much less clearly distributed. I mean, we are no longer in a bipolar or unipolar world, but we are not yet in a multipolar world. This is rather chaotic. And with lack of clarity in power relations, we see small and medium-sized countries becoming spoilers in different conflicts in different parts of the world in total impunity. So I hope that we'll slowly move into a multipolar world, but again, I repeat it, multipolarity is not in itself the solution. Europe was multipolar before the First World War. In the absence of multilateral forms of governance, the result was the First World War. So to have a stronger multilateralism, more inclusive, it's no longer an intergovernmental multilateralism we need. We need other stakeholders. How can we deal with the digital revolution if we don't have the business community, the science community, the private sector involved? I mean, we need forms of regulation that are more soft, more flexible, but involving more stakeholders in the way they are put into place. So it's an inclusive multilateralism that you need. And we need to understand that it doesn't make sense to have silos. Peace and security, development, humanitarian. No, I mean, we need to work much more between the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the international financial institutions, the World Trade Organization. We are all part of the same reality. And we need to be able to converge in what we do in a much more effective and institutional way. For the moment, we have excellent cooperation. For instance, Kristalina Georgieva and I, we are on the phone all the time, and we really work together fantastically well. But this is not, it cannot depend on the goodwill of people. There must be an institutional approach to networking our multilateral system to make it much more effective.
Yeah, I like the way you said inclusive multilateralism. Thank you so much, Secretary General Guterres there of the United Nations.
It was a great pleasure, and I wish you the best success in your discussions.